Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my top 12 running back rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. Now, before we begin today's video, let me remind all of you, timestamps are down in the description of the video. So if you're looking to hear me talk about one of these specific 12, 13 running backs, go ahead and check that out. Also, while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Again, I will be bringing 2020 fantasy football content for the entirety of the season, this off season, whether it's rankings, mock drafts, etc., all the way through the regular season, where I'll be doing weekly rankings. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And if you like today's video, don't forget to click the like button. Also, if you're down there, you have a question, comment, concern, the comment section is perfect for that, so I can get back to you. Before we begin the video, also a couple things. Rankings are subject to change. Again, like it says above me, this is a video done early in July, and the season's only 2 months away. Yes, but again, a lot can change over that time. So again, don't forget, rankings are subject to change. And on today's video, we'll be doing rankings for half PPR scoring formats. Again, I try to meet everyone in the middle. Those of you who play in a standard league, those of you playing a full PPR league, I feel that it's fair to have a half PPR ranking, kind of meet everyone in the middle. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's talk about my number one running back for the 2020 fantasy football season. That's Christian McCaffrey. And I believe he's probably the number one running back for just about everybody going into this season because of how legendary he was last season. I mean, the amount of records he broke last season just keep adding up. And it's kind of a surprise considering how, average the Carolina Panthers were, especially as soon as Cam Newton went down with his injury, and then the quarterback play from Kyle Allen, Will Grier, that just wasn't, good enough. It got Ron Rivera fired, yet Christian McCaffrey was the only consistent part of this offense that was putting up incredible numbers. And for those of you who had him last season, you were blessed. I mean, this guy had 1,387 rushing yards, 15 rushing touchdowns, had 141 targets, 116 receptions. Now, that number definitely legendary considering he broke his own record from 2018 for most receptions by a running back in a singular season. So he holds the top two, stats in that record, which is absolutely incredible. On top of it, 116 receptions is no joke. That was only second to Michael Thomas this past season. Yeah, in a full PPR, this guy was a machine. Half PPR, you definitely got rewarded for those 116 receptions. Those receptions led to 1,005 receiving yards, making Christian McCaffrey the third running back in NFL history to finish a 1,000 rushing and 1,000 receiving yard season. Again, legendary. I mean, that's pretty much the perfect word to describe this. Overall, Christian McCaffrey was unstoppable. The guy had 413.2 half PPR scoring points, averaging to 25.825 fantasy points per game on average. I mean, Christian McCaffrey was unstoppable, but it wasn't just 2019. We saw this coming in 2018 from weeks 9 through 16 of the season. Going back to 2018, Christian McCaffrey was putting up incredible performances in which he was averaging 24.175 fantasy points per game in that 8-game stretch. So in the last, if you want to count it, 24 games, Christian McCaffrey has averaged 25.275 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. I mean, that's consistency through and through, and that's why Christian McCaffrey is sitting atop of this list and why he will be the most trustworthy running back going in the 2020 fantasy football season. Now, besides the fact that this guy's been incredible, we talk about the receptions. In any sort of league where you get points for any sort of reception your running back gets, that's just something that you really can't replace. Christian McCaffrey had 11 games last season of 6+ receptions. He had 5 games of 10+ receptions. He only had 2 performances last season of less than 19 fantasy points. Christian McCaffrey was the Terminator. Absolutely unstoppable. Now, many people think Christian McCaffrey is a small running back. He can't be given as many touches. Again, the amount of touches he had last season are undeniable. He's going to continue to carry the Carolina Panthers offense, especially with the new contract he was given. And especially as the offense continues to improve around him, it may make him an even better player. Again, adding a quarterback that, in my opinion, Teddy Bridgewater is better than a Kyle Allen or a Will Grier. That's going to even give this offense more opportunities and potentially Christian McCaffrey more opportunities. As his team moves down the field, we could potentially see him with more red zone opportunities, which we love to see. Again, last season, Christian McCaffrey led all running backs with rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. So when we're talking about, hey, we want to hand it to our running back, have him plug the hole and jump over a pile or run over a couple defensive linemen, Christian McCaffrey is capable of doing that. He had 17 rushing attempts for 8 rushing touchdowns. He had 17 of his team's 21 rushing attempts last season in the red zone. And that makes a huge difference. When you're scoring 8 touchdowns on the goal line, comparatively to years past when Cam Newton was on roster, Cam Newton was taking 4, 5, 6 rushing touchdowns a year by himself because of the design of the offense. Without a rushing quarterback like Newton, Christian McCaffrey is more in line to get more of these rushing touchdowns, making his viability in fantasy even better for fantasy owners, especially for those of you who have the number 1 overall pick this coming season. On top of it, when we talk about red zone opportunities, this guy led the team in receptions and targets in the red zone last season for the Carolina Panthers. He didn't have as many receiving touchdowns in the red zone as DJ Moore, but 3 receiving touchdowns in the red zone. I mean, that's all you can ask for from a running back like Christian McCaffrey. He's absolutely incredible. And I don't really want to keep talking about him because, to be honest, I could talk about him all day and how amazing he's going to be. The fact that he plays in the NFC South, which is a division that for sure goes back and forth scoring with high scoring matchups between the two teams. But overall, Christian McCaffrey, he's my number 1 overall running back. A lot of safety in this pick, especially because of the receptions that he is in line for and the offense improving around him. I'm just very confident in this position for Christian McCaffrey. So let's go ahead and move on to my number 2 overall running back, Saquon Barkley. Now, here's the thing about Saquon Barkley. Saquon last year had a little bit of a setback. The injury definitely didn't help him, but yet, as soon as he came back and the team finally gave him the full opportunity that he really needed, Saquon Barkley really got back on track. Yes, he may have finished last season with 1,003 rushing yards, 6 rushing touchdowns, only 73 targets, 52 receptions, 438 receiving yards for 2 receiving touchdowns, and finished with 218.1 fantasy points, finished as RB number 10 last season, averaging 16.78 fantasy points. That's all in well, especially considering the fact he only played 13 games. A 17 almost point per game average in a half PPR scoring format is fantastic. But what can we see from Saquon Barkley come in 2020? That's the biggest question. And to be honest, yes, the injury that plagued him a little bit last season, besides the fact that it made him miss majority of that Tampa Bay game in which he was inflicted with the injury and a couple games after that. And then even once he came back, the team didn't really want to give him too many touches because they thought, well, if this team's not going to make the playoffs, why take our franchise blue chip running back and run him into the ground when he's not 100% healthy, which I agree with. But what we ended up seeing in 2019, which was very promising, was the opportunities he was getting. He had 18.3 attempts per game when healthy, which is an increase of 2 total attempts from 2018. That's a great margin to see, honestly. When we talk about the receiving game, sure. In 2018, this was a guy that had 91 receptions on 121 targets. We know he's a capable receiver as much of a running back. But this past season, we didn't see as much. But hopefully with Daniel Jones improving, this offense improving, we could potentially see Saquon Barkley be utilized even more out of the backfield now that he's fully healthy and we're ready to just let him completely run loose with this offense. This is a guy, again, that had 2,000 all-purpose yards in 2018, 15 touchdowns, 91 receptions. He's definitely capable of that. That's not even his ceiling, in my opinion, because he's definitely capable of even more now that he's gained more experience and that the team that surrounds him is even better. When we're talking about running backs that we can trust with a top 3 pick, Saquon Barkley definitely comes to mind because of the fact that we know he's a guy that's capable of touching the ball 350 times in a healthy way and continuing to produce on a consistent basis. Again, this is a guy that averaged 5 yards per carry his rookie year. This past season, even with all the injuries, the lack of protection up front, this guy still averaged 4.6 yards per carry for the New York Giants. It's absolutely incredible. And I think he's only going to improve considering how young he is. As of right now, the opportunity is there. As long as the health is there this offseason, going into the regular season, the offense that surrounds him, Daniel Jones, this wide receiver core, having a healthy tight end like Evan Ingram, being able to stretch the field, improving the offensive line. That's exactly what they did with the draft. They spent a 1st-round pick and a 3rd-round pick improving that because this team wants to run the ball, and I expect them to do so. There were a lot of times that you looked at Saquon Barkley this past season and you thought to yourself, that doesn't really look like Saquon. Yeah, well, that was mainly due to the injury. Now that he's back and he's coming full speed ahead with the New York Giants offense, who looks to be a little bit retooled going into 2020, I expect to see a lot more of Saquon Barkley. Last season in the red zone, 7 attempts for 1 rushing touchdown from the 5-yard line in. That's something that was nearly halved this comparatively to 2018. We saw Saquon Barkley have, in fact, I think he was the top 3. He had top 3 in attempts in red zone rushing just last season in 2018. These numbers will increase. His touchdowns will increase. And I expect Saquon Barkley to have a fantastic 2020 season. He's my number 2. A quick stat before we move on to our number 3. Saquon Barkley in his first 2 years has just as many rushing touchdowns as Josh Allen. Just to kind of put that in perspective, Josh Allen has 17 rushing touchdowns, and so does Saquon Barkley. Saquon should be able to maybe separate himself this year, but Josh Allen, that's a pretty interesting number. They've played nearly the same amount of games as well. All right, moving on to my number 3 running back going into the 2020 season, Ezekiel Elliott. I think Ezekiel Elliott, considering his safety, his body of work, this guy is in line to always be in the top 3, top 4 conversation based purely on that and the offense that surrounds him. Last season, Ezekiel Elliott, again, had a holdout, didn't join the team until a couple weeks prior to the regular season beginning. And even with that, with a little bit of a slow start, he still finished with 1,357 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, which was a great increase from the season prior. 71 targets, 54 receptions for 2 receiving touchdowns. Again, this is a guy that was far more reliable in the passing game in 2018, but considering the way that this offense has transformed, Dak Prescott spreading out to Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, and it was Randall Cobb last season, it kind of took away from Ezekiel Elliott's opportunity in the passing game. But then again, he still had great opportunity with 54 receptions, finishing with 284.7 fantasy points, 17.79 fantasy points per game. Again, like I mentioned earlier, he had a slow start. In the first 3 games of the 2019 season, Tony Pollard averaged 10 rushing attempts per game. That was taken away from Zeke. Imagine you add that back on, a fully healthy Zeke, a guy that's in shape, conditioned, ready to go for the season. I expect Zeke to be, again, a top 3 back going into the 2020 season. When we talk about Zeke and his career thus far, his body of work, like I mentioned before, in his first 4 seasons in the National Football League, Zeke has averaged 19.2 fantasy points per game. Since 2017, no other running back has rushed for more 100-plus yard gains, as Zeke has done that 14 times. Ezekiel Elliott is an absolute monster, and when we think about the Dallas Cowboys offense, as they add Mike McCarthy as their head coach, and the offense continues to move towards this trend of passing the ball more with Dak Prescott, we've seen that change, but Ezekiel Elliott has still stayed consistent. In 2016 and 2017, we saw the Dallas Cowboys run the ball 50.8% of the time. Just this past 2 seasons, in 2018 and 2019, they ran the ball 44.2% of the time. And yes, that might cause you to panic, but I want you not to panic because, in fact, that's only because Dak Prescott's passing attempts have gone up. That doesn't mean that Ezekiel Elliott's opportunity on the ground has been taken away, because in 3 of the past 4 seasons, obviously the one season would be his suspension where he only played 10 games, but in every season when he's played 15 or more games, he has gotten over 300 rushing attempts, and that's consistent for him. On top of that, he's continued to improve. I understand maybe his opportunity is not as much there on the ground, considering they're passing the ball more, but per touch, Ezekiel Elliott has continued to improve over the years. In 2017, fantasy points per touch, Ezekiel Elliott averaged 0.71 fantasy points per touch. In 2018, increased that number to 0.76. And this past season, in 2019, had a 0.802 fantasy point per touch. He's continuing to improve. And that's obviously has to do with his more involvement in the passing game, getting more opportunities in the red zone. Again, this guy had 12 attempts from the 5-yard line, leading to 9 rushing touchdowns. The only other person to run the ball from that close in was Dak Prescott, who led to his touchdowns. Tony Pollard has no say in the red zone work. Ezekiel Elliott is definitely going to dominate that, as he usually has. Again, Ezekiel Elliott, we may think that Dak Prescott having this 3 wide receiver set, them using a first-round pick on CeeDee Lamb, may be something to worry about. To be honest, that's not the case. When you add 3 wide receiver sets, it not only stretches out the defense, but it makes it so where the defense can't really stack the box with 8+ defenders. And what we know from this Dallas Cowboys offensive line and Ezekiel Elliott and his ability, they're definitely capable of running all over defenses. And last season, Ezekiel Elliott, he did face 8+ defenders in the box 19.7% of the time. If that number drops at all, Ezekiel Elliott's going to have way more breakaway runs, which he struggled with, especially last year. But I can definitely see him taking over and being a fantastic running back, and that's why he's my number 3. Again, I'm not really worried about the Mike McCarthy offensive approach going back to the days of the Green Bay Packers where they really didn't use a running back. That's not the case. They all know that Ezekiel Elliott is one of the best running backs in the National Football League. His body of work proves it, and he's definitely going to be ready for this coming season. He's got a great offense surrounding him, and I expect him to do great things this season. So, Ezekiel Elliott, he is my number 3. Moving on to number 4. Now, you may be thinking, okay, Andrew, Dalvin Cook has had a lot of question marks this offseason. Is Dalvin Cook going to play? Currently, he's on a holdout. Now, that definitely brings up a couple questions, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to talk about the excellence of Dalvin Cook last season. Dalvin Cook was absolutely incredible, a guy that you could have gotten as a late, maybe perhaps in the second round running back who was definitely a league winner. This is a guy that had 1,135 rushing yards, 13 rushing touchdowns, 63 targets that led to 53 receptions for 519 receiving yards. Didn't get any receiving touchdowns, but all in all, in 13 games, or was it 13 games? He had 265.9 fantasy points that led to an 18.99 fantasy point per game average. Averaging nearly 19 fantasy points per game is absolutely incredible considering what Dalvin Cook and this Vikings offense was capable the year prior. We saw a lot of injuries from the first 2 seasons of Dalvin Cook's career. And yes, that continued to follow him in 2019. But the fact of the matter is, if we can find ourselves a healthy Dalvin Cook, we're talking about a running back that could potentially even jump Ezekiel Elliott and jump Saquon Barkley into the number 2 spot. Last season, from weeks 1 through 11, Dalvin Cook averaged 21.43 fantasy points and had an average of 23.5 rushing attempts per game. I mean, this is an incredible number. We're talking about Dalvin Cook being a running back that 100% over a 16-game basis could have been the number 2 overall running back with 342.88 fantasy points if he had stayed healthy, only behind Christian McCaffrey. I mean, this is a guy that, without a doubt in my mind, is the workhorse back of his team. I understand Alexander Mattison sits there, but without a doubt in my mind, Dalvin Cook is the guy that they want to feed. He is the running back for their team, and that's why he wants the long-term deal, because he even knows he's the future of this team. Now, with how successful Alexander Mattison was last season, that kind of brings up a couple questions. Where are we going to see Dalvin Cook end this season? Is he going to sign? Is he going to play? Boy, I hope so. I'm assuming via this ranking that he does play, and he finishes as the number 4 overall running back. And that's mainly because, Dalvin Cook is as talented as you may think. And yes, injuries may plague him, but what we've seen over his career, I mean, the numbers are just undeniable. In the 21 games that Dalvin Cook has produced and played over 60% of the offensive snaps, he's averaged 17.43 attempts, 5.05 targets, 4.1 receptions, 118.7 total yards, and 0.71 touchdowns on average. These averages are incredible. When you want to feed the ball and you keep Dalvin Cook on the field, he's going to produce without a doubt, and he's proven that. In the red zone, this is a guy that's ready to bang on the line of scrimmage, having 15 attempts from the 5 yards and in for 9 rushing touchdowns, tied for second most, and even had the most rushing attempts from the 10-yard line and in the red zone. This is a guy that, in my opinion, is extremely talented in an offense that wants to run the ball, was very fond of how they approached and really shattered teams with their offensive line, and allowing Dalvin Cook to get to the second level, get to the third level, and dominate. Again, a lot of teams might not want to, especially the Minnesota Vikings, they might not want to sign players right now to big contracts because they don't know how the salary cap is going to look like next year. So this could really lead to Dalvin Cook, Melvin Gordon, situation, or even an Ezekiel Elliott situation where he doesn't come back until a couple weeks prior. But hopefully he does. And if he does, I expect him to be a great running back. That's why he's my number 4. Moving on to number 5, Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry was unstoppable. When we're talking about running backs that you can just watch and that just pass the eye test in terms of they're just a bowling ball on the field and nobody can stop them no matter what. That's what Derrick Henry truly is. Last season, he won the rushing title with 1,540 rushing yards, 16 rushing touchdowns, only had 24 targets for 18 receptions, still had 2 receiving touchdowns. That's fantastic. Even with the lack of usage in the passing game, he's still going to score touchdowns, still going to get yards. He averaged 5.1 yards per carry last season, all while he was facing 8+ defenders 35% of the time last season. This is a guy that averaged 19.04 fantasy points per game and total 285 half PPR fantasy points. Derrick Henry is an absolute monster, and when we look at what he was capable of doing all of last season, he only played 15 regular season games, but when we talk about his additions and his rushing attempts that we can add on top of it in the playoffs, I mean, a physical running back just doesn't describe Derrick Henry. This is a guy that had 409 touches total last season, and his body was still churning, his legs were still running over people. On top of it, Derrick Henry finished the final game of the regular season with 32 total carries. In the first 2 playoff games, he had another 34 and 30 carries. That's 96 carries in 3 games. Derrick Henry is not human, and he absolutely proved that last season by doing that in back-to-back weeks, all while averaging throughout the entire regular season 4.18 yards after contact per attempt. This is a guy that you may be thinking Derrick Henry's a bowling ball. All he wants to do is run you over like a LeGarrette Blount or a Marshawn Lynch, but that's not the case. He is one of the most bursty and elusive running backs in the National Football League. Last season, had 42 rushing attempts of 10+ yards, had 9 rushing attempts of 20+ yards, and on top of it was the 4th most elusive running back according to PFF last season. This is not just a running back that's going to run you over with a talented offensive line. This is a guy that's just going to dominate you in all facets of the running game. Now, there's 2 sides to every coin. And Derrick Henry, prior to the addition to Ryan Tannehill in this offense, wasn't the Derrick Henry that I'm talking about. During weeks 1 through 6, Derrick Henry was a great running back. He finished as the number 14 running backs from weeks 1 through 6, averaging 14.13 fantasy points per game. That's nothing to complain about. But when Tannehill was added into the offense from weeks 7 through 17, Derrick Henry was unstoppable. He was the number 2 running back only behind Christian McCaffrey and averaged 22.3 points when Tannehill was under center. That makes a huge difference, and as we can potentially see him maybe leaning towards that number even more in 2020, Derrick Henry is a guy that I'm really, really excited about going into 2020. Again, this is a guy that even in the playoffs with Tannehill, in those games, averaged 22.44 fantasy points per game. He was absolutely incredible. On the goal line, he's always going to get those attempts. He had 10 rushing attempts from the 5-yard line in for 7 rushing touchdowns. Nobody else outside of Ryan Tannehill had rushing attempts from that close. So we know that his rushing attempts are protected for certain. This is a guy that, in my opinion, his durability is there. We really don't have to worry about health. I know he missed 1 game. I think it was week 16 of last season against the New Orleans Saints. That in itself was just a body check. They knew they were going to make the playoffs. They needed to rest him so that the next week they can beat a division rival in order to make the playoffs. Everything was calculated. I believe Derrick Henry will be healthy and will be ready to roll this season. He's my number 5. Moving on to my number 6 running back, Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara last season was underwhelming, and that was mainly because he was injured. And when we look at his injuries that he faced last season, a knee PCL sprain, grade 2, pedal ankle sprain, grade 1. To be honest, the fact that he was dealing with a knee and ankle injury and only managed to miss 2 games is kind of a surprising factor. When this offseason came along, Alvin Kamara was the first one to let everybody know he was only 75% healthy last season. He really wasn't ready to go, even when he came back and started playing. But Alvin Kamara did his best, had 797 rushing yards for 5 rushing touchdowns, 97 targets, 81 receptions. That's 81 receptions for the last 3 seasons in a row. Imagine that's an incredible number. 533 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, 208.02 fantasy points for a 14.86 fantasy point per game average. Honestly, he finishes the number 12 running back despite only scoring 6 touchdowns. I mean, that's a pretty ridiculous number in my opinion. And that's often, mainly because the rest of the running back field just wasn't as talented or wasn't given as much opportunity. But when we think about what Alvin Kamara has done in 2017 and 2018, he had a far lesser year. In 2017, he had a total of 13 touchdowns. In 2018, he had a total of 18 touchdowns. This past season, a total of 6. That means that was a 12 touchdown, regression this past season, which honestly makes a huge difference. And if we could potentially see him increase his numbers in rushing attempts, stay healthy, get more touchdowns, get more work in the passing game. Again, those numbers were only for 13 games. I could potentially see Alvin Kamara being even better, and that's why he's sitting as my number 6 running back. This is a guy that had 11 games of 5+ receptions last season, and again, 81 receptions a year for the past 3 years. You know that PPR, half PPR formats, this guy is extremely valuable. On top of it, he's had 27 games in his entire career of 5+ receptions, and that's a huge difference maker when we're talking about half PPR, full PPR. Now, the thing that Alvin Kamara struggles with the most is rushing attempts. He's never really given that many. 10 on average per game seems like the number. He's only surpassed 100 rushing yards twice in his career. And that's something that definitely hurts Alvin Kamara. But if he's going to be the goal line back, if he's going to get those 10 reception games like he always does with Drew Brees, there's always a possibility that this guy, if he stays healthy, is going to be able to dominate. Let's not forget, in the 2 games that he missed, Latavius Murray was given 62 total touches this past season. He led for 2 games in a row of 100 plus rushing yards and 4 touchdowns. Those kind of numbers added to a Kamara resume from last season definitely would make a difference and would have made him potentially a top 6 back. Talking about him at the number 12 spot last season, that doesn't really truly emulate exactly what kind of a running back Alvin Kamara is. And hopefully a lot of your league mates think, Alvin Kamara is a little washed up, which is not the case. Maybe you can even get him at a discount. Seeing as he's my number 6 running back, I'm assuming that teams are going to pass up on him for the other opportunities at running back going into the 2020 season. But this is not a guy that you should be sleeping on. He has one of the most offensively talented teams in the National Football League. Drew Brees, Michael Thomas, on top of Emmanuel Sanders joining the team, Jared Cook, one of the best offensive lines. I mean, in terms of a right tackle, left tackle combo, neither of those guys gave up a sack this past season. And to be honest, they're only improving. Drafting first round offensive linemen in the last couple of years, that's going to make a huge difference, and it's going to help Alvin Kamara. I know Latavius Murray is still there. In my opinion, he is going to continue to be a flex option in good matchups or otherwise a handcuff for you, which is definitely tough. You're going to have to draft him and pick him up. But either way, Alvin Kamara, I expect him to have a great season here. He's my number 6. Moving on. My number 7 is Nick Chubb. I think a lot of people are sleeping on Nick Chubb this season. This is a guy that honestly was supposed to be the rushing champion until Derrick Henry in the final week came and took it away from him. Nick Chubb had 1,494 rushing yards, 5 rushing touchdowns. Didn't get too much work in the passing game, but then again was still effective with 49 targets, 36 receptions for 278 receiving yards. Total with 237.2 fantasy points, 14.825 fantasy point per game average. Now, again, like all these other running backs that I've mentioned, there are sometimes 2 sides to a coin. There is the weeks that Nick Chubb had without Kareem Hunt, and then there's the weeks where Kareem Hunt was active and playing, and how that affected Nick Chubb overall. Now, the thing that we need to know is that without a doubt, the play of Nick Chubb wasn't decreased. Nick Chubb played 73% of the offensive snaps without Kareem Hunt from weeks 1 through 9. And then after that, weeks 10 through 17, he still played 73% of the offensive snaps. It's not like his opportunity was decreased in terms of playing on the field, but rather Kareem Hunt was, getting a couple, receptions here and there that may have led to a couple extra points that Nick Chubb was relying upon in the first half of the season. From weeks 1 through 9, Nick Chubb averaged 17.36 points. And in the later half of the season, weeks 10 through 17 with Kareem Hunt on roster and active, he averaged nearly 10 points less with 12.29. Now, sorry, not 10 points, 5 points less. A 5-point fantasy drop could definitely take Nick Chubb out of the top 12. But in my opinion, going into the 2020 season, I think we're kind of sleeping on the fact that this new head coach is actually an offensive guru, in my opinion. Kevin Stefanski, comparatively to I don't even know how to describe the offense of the Browns last season. The train wreck of an offense that is so much more polished. What Kevin Stefanski was able to do with the Minnesota Vikings last year. Remember, Stefanski is a guy that was been with the Vikings organization for the last 15 seasons. So he's been around for the Adrian Peterson days. He knows how to build an offense that wants to run the ball. And that's exactly what he's going to bring to the Cleveland Browns offense. Again, last season, the Minnesota Vikings with Kevin Stefanski as their offensive coordinator had the 4th most rushing attempts amongst all teams and 80 more rushing attempts than the Cleveland Browns last season. The additions that they've made this offseason 100% speak to the fact that they want to run the ball. Going ahead and signing Jack Conklin, the right tackle from the Tennessee Titans last season, to become their right tackle, a guy that can definitely run block like no other. Adding a guy like Jedrick Wills from the draft this offseason, the Alabama tackle that's going to be their left tackle. And then also adding Andy Janovich. If you don't know who Andy Janovich is, he's a fullback formerly of the Denver Broncos. When the Vikings, produced last season and were in their best formations, it was typically when CJ Ham, their fullback, was in the lineup and he was, filling holes and lead blocking for a guy like Dalvin Cook. I expect Andy Janovich to be that fullback, especially considering we saw CJ Ham play 35% of the offensive snaps last season. In a league where, fullbacks really aren't used in many offenses, I expect Kevin Stefanski to use that. And I expect this Cleveland Browns offensive attack to be very run-heavy based. And I expect that to entirely improve the offense. I mean, when we saw Kirk Cousins produce last season, Kirk Cousins, if I'm not mistaken, only threw 4 interceptions last season. That's not Kirk Cousins. That's a product of the offense. When you're allowing your quarterback the opportunity to use play action because teams are so worried about how effective you were on the ground, that opens up the offense. It could help Baker Mayfield. It could help Odell Beckham, Jarvis Landry. The 2 tight ends that they have, David Njoku, Austin Hooper, will also be blocking threats for this offense. In my opinion, Dalvin Cook is going to be that Nick Chubb is going to be that workhorse back that Dalvin Cook was last season for the Vikings, but for the Cleveland Browns offense. He was still a monster last season. Let's not forget this. This is a guy that had almost 1,500 rushing yards last season. Imagine when you add an offensive coordinator and head coach that wants to run the ball, that is not going to run the team into the ground, and could potentially lead to even more success considering what they've added this offseason. I think Nick Chubb is in line for a pretty good season. I know Kareem Hunt is going to take away receptions and take away rushing attempts, but I purely think he's going to play the Alexander Madison role, or in fact, maybe even play in the slot position and help out a little bit as a wide receiver, but I don't think it's going to hurt Nick Chubb all that much. He's my number 7. Moving on. Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon is another one of these young, talented running backs, only 24 years old. Again, last season, there's 2 sides of the coin. There's 2 different Joe Mixons. But before we talk about that, let's go over his overall stats. Finished with 1,137 rushing yards, 5 rushing touchdowns, 45 targets, 35 receptions, 287 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, all for 207.9 fantasy points, 12.99 fantasy point per game average. Finished as RB13 in a half PPR scoring format. To be honest, Joe Mixon was 2 different players last season. From weeks 1 through 7, Joe Mixon was not a running back. He was the number 34 overall running back, averaging 7.83 points per game. I mean, to be honest, it was just a mess, considering the fact that the offense was in shambles. They didn't have AJ Green. Andy Dalton didn't look good. This offense just wasn't clicking with the rookie head coach, Zach Taylor. Nothing really wanted to work. But as soon as they kind of figured it out and got everything back on track, Joe Mixon was really the leader of this team. From weeks 8 through 17, he averaged 17 fantasy points per game, nearly a 10-point jump per game average. I mean, that's absolutely incredible in terms of what we saw. He went from averaging 12 rushing attempts per game to 22 rushing attempts per game and getting a 10% snap count increase, which definitely made a difference. When we're talking about a guy that has to compete with Giovanni Bernard every season for receptions, that's definitely going to make a difference. But getting even more snaps on the field, getting more opportunities in the passing game, it's obviously going to lead to success. And I think this offense for the Cincinnati Bengals will be much improved this season. Again, they had the number 1 overall pick. They're bringing in the quarterback. They have AJ Green coming back. They drafted wide receivers. They improved their offensive line. Let's not forget that they drafted Jonah Williams of Alabama last season. He had a season-ending injury in the beginning of the preseason, didn't play last season, and they're bringing in Xavier Suafilo. This is another good offensive guard. They're going to improve. Offensively, they're not going to be the worst team in the National Football League in terms of overall record. Sure, there's a possibility, but in my opinion, their offensive improvements will definitely, speak volumes, in my opinion, and prove to, make this team far better. When we think about Joe Mixon, he is one of the more talented running backs. Since 2017, he's had 43 rushes of 10 plus yards, and that's, honestly only second to Zeke Elliott. And Zeke Elliott has had 150 more rushing attempts than Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon is a talented running back. Don't get it, twisted at all. If Joe Mixon was able to sustain what he did in the second half of the season from weeks 8 through 17 on a 16-game basis, he would have finished last season as the number 5 overall running back. This is a guy that is absolutely talented, and I expect him to be a top 8 running back for that reason, especially considering the offensive improvements. In the last 9 games of the season, Joe Mixon had more rushing attempts than Derrick Henry. Imagine that. He had 4 more rushing attempts. This team believes in Joe Mixon. They're definitely going to feed him the rock because he is a main part of this offense, and I expect him to be fantastic. Last season had 16 rushing attempts from the red zone, 5-yard and in, only led to 4 touchdowns, but again, it's going to continue to increase as this offense gets better. When you get more opportunities to score, it'll only lead to more opportunity for Joe Mixon. Sure, getting 5 reception games is difficult for him. He did not do that last season. He didn't have a single game of 5+ receptions. Definitely can attribute that to Giovanni Bernard. But as he continues to play, as the offense continues to improve, I expect Joe Mixon to improve and him to be a great running back. He is my number 8. Moving on to number 9. We have Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler, again, is one of these running backs that there's 2 sides of the coin. And before I even read any of the stats of what he did last season, I really just want to read what he was capable of doing with and without Melvin Gordon. Last season, without Melvin Gordon, considering the first 4 weeks he was on a holdout, Austin Ekeler was an incredible running back. This guy had 56 rushing attempts for 220 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, 25 targets for 24 receptions, 270 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. He had 95 half PPR scoring points that led to a 23.75 per game average in the first 4 games of the season, while playing nearly 71% of the offensive snaps. Now, even when Melvin Gordon came back from weeks 5 through 17, Austin Ekeler was still a good running back. He still averaged 14 fantasy points per game with a 52% snap share. If you go ahead and we think about Melvin Gordon is no longer going to be a part of this offense, and Austin Ekeler is going to have the opportunity to lead this offense and potentially touch the ball far more often on the ground, besides the fact that he had 92 receptions this past regular season. We're going to see more and more opportunities for this guy, and I expect him to definitely run away with them and become a top 12 running back like he was last season. I expect Austin Ekeler, yes, losing Phillip Rivers makes a big difference, especially considering Phillip Rivers loves to check down. But when you have a rookie quarterback in Tyrod Taylor, and they're both capable of doing similar things and checking down the ball, I expect Austin Ekeler to just be just as good in the passing game, in my opinion. In 10 games that he played last season, he had 5+ receptions. He had 0 drops last season. He's only one of 5 running backs to have over 1,500 total yards from scrimmage last season and 10+ touchdowns. He had 1.17 yards per touch last season, 1.17 fantasy points per touch, last season. He's an incredible running back. And I think with the full opportunity of the Los Angeles Chargers, he's going to be able to run away with it. When we think about the touches that Melvin Gordon has had in the past couple seasons, Melvin Gordon in 2016 had 295 touches. Then the following year had 342. The following year had 225. And then last year had 204. When we think about the touchdowns that Melvin Gordon had, 12, 14, and 9. There is so much opportunity for running backs in this offense. And Austin Ekeler seems to be the guy that's walking into that opportunity. And I expect him to be a fantastic running back. Therefore, he is at my number 9. Moving on to my number 10 running back, Kenyan Drake. Kenyan Drake, again, similar to Austin Ekeler, there's two sides of the coin. There's Kenyan Drake prior to joining the Arizona Cardinals, where he was given a lack of opportunity and he wasn't able to really flourish. And then there's Kenyan Drake with the Cardinals, where he was an absolute monster of a running back and averaged 18.175 fantasy points per game. Last season, Kenyan Drake, he finished with 800 rushing yards, 817 exactly, 8 rushing touchdowns, 68 targets, 50 receptions for 345 receiving yards. Didn't have any receiving touchdowns, but again, a total of 164.2 fantasy points, 11.73. But that doesn't really tell you the story of Kenyan Drake. This is a guy that, as of right now, has signed a franchise tag and is on a 1-year deal at 26 years old. This is a former Alabama running back and a guy that, in my opinion, while he was with the Miami Dolphins, wasn't given the ample opportunity. Let's not forget, Adam Gase cited over giving Frank Gore more attempts in 2018 than Kenyan Drake. And to be honest, that's just a joke. Now that he's finally a part of an offense that can utilize his ability to the maximum potential, he's definitely going to flourish. I mean, when we look at last season, weeks 1 through 7 with the Miami Dolphins, he averaged 7.3 fantasy points per game. He joined the Arizona Cardinals from weeks 9 through 17 and averaged 18.17 fantasy points per game. That's literally an 11-point jump in production in fantasy. I mean, that's insane, but that's not a surprise. Prior to David Johnson getting injured and seeing very little usage in this offense, David Johnson was just as good of a running back. David Johnson averaged 17.72 fantasy points prior to his injury. So it's not a surprise that two running backs that are very similar in stature and in skill were able to produce 17 plus almost 18 fantasy points per game on average. These are guys that, without a doubt in my mind, work perfectly in the Cliff Kingsbury offense. And now that David Johnson is gone, and Kenyan Drake is the 3-down back for this team, I expect him to run away with this job and be a top 12 running back this coming season. When we think about the Cardinals offense, sure, Cliff Kingsbury wants to run 3 and 4 wide receiver sets. And when we looked at what he was capable of doing in 3 or 4 wide receiver sets, they were successful with Kyler Murray. I mean, they ran 3 and 4 wide receiver sets 66% of the time last season. That's incredible, especially considering sometimes they put their running back in the slot position and give them opportunities to run routes, get targets, and get receptions, which David Johnson and Kenyan Drake could both do. On top of it, 11 personnel was their next most popular formation, with 1 tight end and 1 running back, which they ran 32.5% of the time. And in my opinion, that's exactly where Kenyan Drake is going to sit, and he's going to succeed. Without a doubt in my mind, when they're running these 3 wide receiver sets, Kenyan Drake is going to have a lot of opportunity, not only in the passing game, but on the ground. When you have 3 and 4 wide receivers on the field, you're going to stretch defenses. It's going to give them less of an opportunity to stack the box with A+ defenders, and it's going to leave your offensive line in a far greater position and your running back in a far greater position. When we looked at defenses facing against Arizona Cardinals running backs last season, they only stacked the box 8.82% of the time against Kenyan Drake and 5.32% of the time against David Johnson. Truly, they didn't really want to stack the box against this offense, because in a shotgun offense like Cliff Kingsbury's, with the talented receivers like they had last season, it kind of makes it difficult. Now that we go into 2020 and we add DeAndre Hopkins and we have Larry Fitzgerald still coming back for another year, Christian Kirk, Andy Isabella, Keyshawn Johnson, the defenses that they play against, they're going to be stretched thin. And it's going to lead to even more opportunity, in my opinion, for Kenyan Drake. And I expect him to absolutely run away with it. And that's why he's my number 10 running back. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about my number 11 as we almost close out today's running back rankings. Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs, going into his second year, another one of these incredibly good running backs. He had his season cut short last season due to injuries, but what he was able to produce is absolutely promising. With 1,150 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, 27 targets, 20 receptions for 166 receiving yards, and totaled for 181.6 fantasy points, 13.97 yards per game average. Josh Jacobs was definitely on par for having a top 12 season. On a 16-game basis, with the averages that he had, when he was healthy, he would have finished as the number 9 overall running back with 223.5 fantasy points. Now, You may be thinking, well, Josh Jacobs doesn't get much, work in the receiving game. Yes, I understand that. Dwayne Washington, Jalen Richard, these are guys that are in this offense that are taking away potential receptions. But as Josh Jacobs becomes more and more of an experienced running back, I expect them to use him as a receiving back, because as soon as they see Jalen Richard, they're thinking, oh, this is going to be a pass play. You're giving away your hand. So giving Josh Jacobs more of an opportunity, in my opinion, is probably what a guy like John Gruden is probably going to kind of lean towards going into the 2020 season. Now, when we think of Josh Jacobs, he's one of the most elusive running backs in the National Football League. Besides the records that he broke in his rookie season, he did a lot more. He, according to Pro Football Focus, had the most avoided tackles on run plays last season with 69 avoided tackles. And he had the third highest, elusive rate. He was actually the most elusive running back, according to PFF last season. Josh Jacobs is a guy that you may be thinking, this team is trying to run this old school offense just barreling down. Well, when you have a running back that's elusive and can barrel down and at the same time shake a couple defenders at the second and third level, the opportunities that it's creating is definitely going to make a difference. Now, the reason why Josh Jacobs is as low as he is, again, will have to do with the passing game. If he's not going to get as many receptions, it's definitely going to make him less of a viable option. On top of it, he only had 7 rushes of 10 plus yards last season. His breakaway ability is not there. But yet, he still had a great yard per carry average, 4.8 yards per carry. I think he was only below 4 other running backs, which is like Derrick Henry and guys like that. So that definitely kind of leaves him in a promising spot. In terms of opportunity in the red zone, it's there. 10 rushing attempts from the 5 yards in and leading to 5 touchdowns. That number is going to increase. But the number that I saw that was kind of interesting was the fact that, Josh Jacobs didn't have a single touchdown on the road. All of his touchdowns came from home, and that was mainly because their record on the road was 2-6. On the road, the former Oakland Raiders, now Las Vegas Raiders, just weren't able to compete with teams. And in fact, it really hurt Josh Jacobs. Hopefully this coming season, the fact that they've improved their offense, drafting 3 rookie wide receivers, going and getting first-round guys, it's hopefully going to stretch the field. You've brought in the right pieces in order for this offense to be successful. When we're talking about the offensive line for this team, we're talking about Trent Brown, Rodney Hudson, Richie Incognito, Gabe Jackson, Colton Miller. These are guys that are no joke in terms of offensive line. I'm talking about the first 3 guys, Trent Brown, Rodney Hudson, Richie Incognito. These are fantastic offensive linemen who have all been all pros in their days, and they're going to continue to be just as effective. They brought in Jason Witten this offseason to be a blocking titan. They have Derek Carrier. They have Ingold, the fullback. This team is a smash mouth team. They want to run the ball down your throat, and that's what they're going to do, and they're going to do that with their best offensive player, Josh Jacobs. And that's why he sits here as my number 11 running back. Moving on to the last 2 running backs I wanted to talk about. It was kind of difficult for me to kind of think about 2 running backs and decide between Miles Sanders and Aaron Jones, because to be honest, top 12 list in its current form, it's tough to really decide between the 2 and leave one off the list. So I'm going to kind of split it down the middle, and I'm going to have 2 number 12 overall running backs. Let's start off with Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders had 2 sides of the coin. Similar to Austin Ekeler, similar to Kenyan Drake, similar to a lot of these running backs. They had different opportunities at different times during the season, and when they were given the ample opportunity, they ran away with it, and they were fantastic running backs. Miles Sanders last season had 818 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, 63 targets for 50 receptions, 509 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, all for 193.7 fantasy points, 12.11 fantasy points per game. Now, that average 12.1, that's not great, but it's where we saw him in the back half of the season, which kind of entices fantasy owners going into 2020. From weeks 1 through 9, Miles Sanders was a running back that played second fiddle to Jordan Howard. Even Darren Sproles was in the offense. There were guys that were taking reps away from Miles Sanders, and with a 38% snap count, he was only able to average 9.68 points through the first 9 weeks. Once Jordan Howard got injured, the bye week came along, and Miles Sanders was given the full opportunity of this backfield and ran with 77% of the offensive snap counts. He averaged 16.67 fantasy points per game and was incredible. When we think about the Eagles' backfield, we always think that Doug Peterson always wants to run some sort of committee. But to be honest, what we saw him do with Miles Sanders last season really gives us a little bit of the idea that potentially they found their running back of the future. No running back prior to Miles Sanders in the Doug Peterson era has ever had 200 plus touches in a season. Sanders broke that and was the first running back to do so. And in my opinion, kind of leads me to believe that this is their running back of the future. They didn't draft anybody. They didn't sign anybody outside of maybe Boston Scott behind him, who will come in for a couple receptions here and there. Even though, Miles Sanders is a capable receiving back with 10 yards per reception last season, I expect this guy to be their workhorse back, and that's why he's going to make the top 12 this season. I mean, when we think about what Miles Sanders is capable of, again, this is a guy that had 6+ receptions. 6 games of 5+ receptions. That's all while Boston Scott had 3 games in there that had 6+ receptions. I mean, he's going to get his opportunity. The offense for the Eagles is going to improve. They have one of the better offensive lines in the National Football League, without a doubt in my mind. Last season, from weeks 11 through 17, when he was finally the starter, only 4 other running backs had more targets and routes ran than him. I mean, this is a guy that is going to be active in the passing game. We know he's capable of doing so, and if he's given the work on the ground, he can definitely run away with it behind this great offensive line. Now, before I go ahead and finish Miles Sanders' section, we have to go ahead and mention that they're losing Jason Peters this season. I think it's Brandon Brooks tore his Achilles this offseason. He's, in my opinion, the best guard outside of Quentin Nelson and Marshall Yanda last season. That's a huge loss. Halipuli Vaitai, I think that's the guard's name. He's gone. He went to the Lions. They've lost a little bit of beef up front. They still have Lane Johnson. They still have Jason Kelce. They have great offensive linemen, but it's not going to be as good as last season, and that's what's kind of leaning me away from Miles Sanders a tad bit. I understand the Eagles' offense will be improved. Their receivers will be there. They'll have Deshaun Jackson back. They'll have their first-round draft pick. Alshon Jeffrey will be healthy. They'll have their 2 tight end sets. But overall, Miles Sanders, in my opinion, he has the opportunity to be better than the number 12, but at this moment in time, that's where I feel comfortable with him. Now, talking about the last running back on today's list, Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones was a monster last year. Finishes RB2, only behind Christian McCaffrey. Had 1,084 rushing yards, 16 rushing touchdowns, 68 targets for 49 receptions, 474 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, all for 290.3 fantasy points, 18.14 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. I mean, this is a guy that averaged 4.8 yards per carry. So it's no joke that Aaron Jones is a good running back. Behind this offensive line, yes, they lose Brian Bulaga at the right tackle, but they bring in Rick Wagner. That's a pretty good right tackle to fill in that spot. I expect this offense to be good, but the reason why Aaron Jones was such a ridiculously good running back last season was the fact that he scored 19 touchdowns. And a lot of people are going to bring that up this year as the crutch behind Aaron Jones. There's no way he scores 19 touchdowns again. It's impossible. And I agree. I do not think that he meets that number again. But if we take away 9 touchdowns from his 2019 season, he still finishes as the number 9 running back. So taking away his 19 touchdowns and making it 10, still finishes as a top 12 guy last season. And with the fact that he was splitting carries with Jamal Williams for majority of the season, kind of leads me to believe that Aaron Jones has a very good opportunity in this offense and could definitely surpass the number 12 spot and be a top 8 running back in my opinion. Overall, Aaron Jones, his volatility kind of scares me. That's why I have him at 12, and that's why I don't have him any higher. Aaron Jones' volatility often has to do with the fact that he scored a lot of touchdowns, sure, but a lot of those games were 3 touchdown, 4 touchdown games that made a huge difference. In 5 games, Aaron Jones produced 27 plus fantasy points last season, while in another 5 games, he produced 6 or less fantasy points. That kind of volatility scares me because sure, he could lead you to win one week, but he could also be the reason you lose in the next week. And not having a stable enough running back that puts up, 17, 18 points on week average every single week with that kind of consistency scares me. Sure, I love the ceiling, but the bottom floor of 6 points, 4.3 points, whatever it ends up being, just it's too scary in my opinion. Now, a lot of the fact that Aaron Jones was so successful last season can be attributed to the fact that there really isn't much talent at the wide receiver and tight end position for the Green Bay Packers. I mean, let's think about it this way. Jamal Williams, the second string running back, had 6 touchdowns last season. The second string running back had 6. So imagine what the starting running back is capable of doing, and that's what we saw. You know, when Davante Adams went down with an injury last season, it really led to, hey, you know what? Aaron Jones has to carry this team, because outside of, you know, him and Jamal Williams, Jimmy Graham's not doing anything. We don't see Marquez Valdez-Scantling producing. Geronimo Allison's joke. You know, Equanimous St. Brown disappeared. You know, sure, Alan Lazard, maybe. But really, there isn't much talent there. There was only one receiver last season that had over 500 receiving yards, and that was Davante Adams, who still only played 12 games last season. All in all, when Davante Adams comes back, touchdowns will be going his direction. That will be taken away from Aaron Jones. But it will not kill Aaron Jones' value. This is a guy that had 4+ receptions in 8 games last season, even with Jamal Williams in the lineup. You may be thinking A.J. Dillon being drafted is going to take a lot of the goal line work. Well, last season on the goal line, in the red zone, Aaron Jones had 13 rushing attempts for 8 touchdowns. He's definitely a guy that had 15 touchdowns just in the red zone total in the passing and rushing game. A lot of his touchdowns come from the red zone, and I believe they trust him. Let's think about the head coach for this team. He was formerly the offensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans. When we think about what Matt LaFleur does for this offense, he wants to run the ball. He wants to have an offense that is predicated on play action and running the ball. And when we think about what he last did with Derrick Henry, where he really didn't give him many opportunities and rather went with a more athletic guy that could be used in the passing game, that's kind of where I see this Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon kind of situation. Sure, A.J. Dillon can come in and plug a couple holes here and there, but all in all, I expect Aaron Jones to have far more of the offensive snap count and far more of the opportunity, and if, you know, in my opinion, potentially all the goal line work. So that's pretty much it. That closes out today's top 12 rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. If you like today's video, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and catch me next time as we'll be talking about rankings, mock drafts, and all that kind of jazz. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate you guys spending your time here today. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.